So last week we visited the period of the 20s. I call them the not-so-roaring 20s, a period when the values were contrasted in a way. There were many highs and many lows in those values. We visited a scene in a Ford parking lot early in 29, which was a foreshadowing of what was to come later that year. Today I'm going to deal with Hoover. Hoover's last stand is what I call this. Basically, we're going to deal with the rails, the culture that developed along the rails of this country. We're going to deal with the Rouge riots, and we're going to deal with the bonus expeditionary march on Washington. Hoover was inaugurated in March of 1929. The great crash took place only 7 months later. When he was inaugurated, both he and Henry Ford were lauded as the greatest men in the country, probably the most admired men in American history at that time. By 1932, they were two of the most reviled men in the country. What had happened? The American middle class was numbed by what had just happened. They had continued for some time in a state of shock, bewilderment, denial, hostages, as it were, to a dream gone bad. The Rotarians, the Kiwanians, the Toastmasters had all done exactly what they were supposed to do. They were boosters. They were great players in this new age of consumerism. And then, of course, it all fell apart. The stock market was a gift that just kept on giving. This was a marvelous toy. God had meant us all to be rich. And suddenly we weren't. All you had to do was plunk down 10%, and suddenly you owned major equity, and that equity kept carooming up exponentially. And all you had to do was sit back and watch it caroom up off the boards. Well, clearly God had meant for us all to be rich. If not, why had he given us this wonderful toy? But now suddenly all of this artificially created paper assets had vanished. They'd vanished in an instant. And there was nothing for the businessmen to sell, nothing for the great boosters to boost. The period of Babbitt, Main Street was over. And sadly, the wiped out businessmen still continued hopefully to gaze at the tapes as if by some miracle the market would come back, even though they'd already been sold out. They had nothing to invest. Now that there was no basis even for dreaming, our entire value system had been shaken to its core. The clarion call of the Harding and Coolidge administrations had been self-reliance, and the economy had thrived. Hoover had echoed the sentiment in his inaugural address in March of that year, and he was a shining example of the heights that could be attained by making the best possible use of one's God-given talents. Well, the word then about this man Hoover, probably one of the most misunderstood presidents in American history. Hoover was born in Iowa in 1879. He was born a Quaker and raised a Quaker, but he was orphaned at the age of 10. It had a major impact on his entire life. He was raised by Quaker relatives and eventually was able, though he was poor and very deficient in English, was able to enroll in Stanford University on the coast. He was able to do that because these were the first years of Stanford University, and they needed students, and he was able to go and get a scholarship to go. It sort of handled and measured and influenced his entire career, because his career before that had been one of chaos, and now he wanted orderliness because of the fact that he had no parents and was raised by relatives and really had no roots and no basis for it to go. Now suddenly he wanted orderliness, and he brought that, and he became an engineer. One thing about the Quakers, they feel that they're not opposed to worldly success, and they weren't certainly in his case. But they also believe firmly that one has a duty to give back. And this significantly influenced Hoover's career. Well, despite the fact that lack of means, he did well at Stanford, but he did not align himself with the upper class. He aligned himself with the anti-fraternity group called the Barbarians. And these were not legatees of privilege. Graduating as an engineer, he first got a blue-collar job in a mine. And from that point on, his career began to take off. He accepted a position as a mining engineer in the Pacific, and eventually became an absolutely brilliant Renaissance man, proving adept as a financier, a geologist, a promoter, and an engineer, and a metallurgist. By the age of 29, Hoover had amassed a fortune of $4 million. In those days, an incredible amount of money. And it was already time, at age 29, for him to begin to give back. And give back he did in spades. Hoover was credited with organizing and directing the Commission for the Relief of Belgium, the First World War. Now, a word about Belgium. Belgium was a neutral in the First World War, but actually and unfortunately, because of its geographic location, it had to be gone through as a result of the Schlieffen Plan that the Germans had erected to circumvent the Maginot Line, to circumvent the eastern wall of France, to go up through Belgium and Holland and down to France. They used the same strategy which was devised by a general named Schlieffen early in the 20th century, in around 1905. They used it not only in the First World War successfully, but in the Second World War successfully. But Belgium was in the way, and Belgium suffered immeasurably. Hoover mounted a volunteer army, basically, to relieve Belgium, and he did a marvelous job of it. It was something that got him the moniker not only of the great engineer, but the great humanitarian. As a matter of fact, John Maynard Keynes, a great economist, said of Hoover, he's the only man who emerged from the tragedy that was Versailles with his an enhanced reputation. So he was eagerly sought after by both parties, though he hadn't entered politics. The cabinet people in the Wilson administration tried to urge him to join the Democratic Party and to run. The then Assistant Secretary of the Navy said, he's truly a wonder. I wish you could make him president. There couldn't be a better one. Of course, later, FDR would change his mind. But by that time, Hoover was already the Republican presidential standard bearer and well on his way to the White House. The Democrats tried to draft Hoover in 1920, but eventually he plunked down on the side of the Republicans. And he became a very active person in politics. He was Secretary of Commerce during both the Coolidge and Harding and Coolidge administrations. And he acted very well. He was not a strict laissez-faire economist. As a matter of fact, at one point, he was proactive in adopting measures which would establish what was called a prosperity reserve fund to set aside assets during good years, during strong years like we were having, to provide jobs when times weren't so good. It was really reminiscent of Joseph's dream, Joseph's interpretation of the dream in the Bible. You may remember the 7 fat years that he interpreted, the 7 lean years, setting aside for Egypt a storehouse. Same kind of thing. Hoover favored, believe it or not, a graduated income tax. He favored heavy taxation of inheritance so as to disintegrate large fortunes. Policies were hardly policies one would associate with Republicans and conservatism at that time. His vision of America was an interesting vision. It was one of self-reliance. The very factors that had built this country, that were spotted in our people by writers that came here, and that were spotted in our people and encouraged in our people by Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, our founders. But it was not a dog-eat-dog, devil-take-the-hindmost individualism. There was a lot of Quakerism involved in it. He wanted socially responsible individualists in this country. And in his book, called American Individualism, he said the following, quote, "I believe we in America are developing a new economic thought, a new basis of community action, of cooperation." He clung to this belief, which was shared by a great many Americans at the time. People could be persuaded to cooperate voluntarily and to share, to help their neighbors. Coercion by government in this regard was not only unnecessary, but counterproductive. That was Hoover. But at the same time, he became increasingly disillusioned by what he saw as oppressive government interference in Europe and intervention. During his candidacy in 1928, he moved further and further to the right, denouncing the many failures of government tyrannical interference in business. So where was the flaw? Where was the crack in the armor? What caused the Greek tragedy that became Herbert Hoover? When you think of Herbert Hoover, you think of failure. Why? Well, one major flaw, perhaps, was the fatal one, was the capacity for self-delusion, the inability to admit failure. Also, he was fearful of conflict. Didn't like conflict. His was a life of reason, and he was almost irrational in his defense of it. We'll see FDR next week, and the week following that as a totally different kind of human being, one who thrived in conflict, who set people off, cabinet ministers and stuff, one against the other, not Hoover. World was based on rationality. He was irrational in defense of it. So he tried to elicit from the American people a vast voluntary effort, as he had in the war, during the war, and to save Europe. Well, he wanted to avoid at all costs the demoralizing effects of the federal dole. So he deviated from this rigid position by establishing what was known as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. That was a corporation to lend money to the banks and to businesses to try to jumpstart the economy on a trickle-down basis. But he was not willing to deal with unemployment and steadfastly refused to believe that the farmers in Arkansas were starving to death. They were. And what he did was he erected a program and to feed the hogs of those farmers in Arkansas. The farmers could starve, but not their hogs. The farmers, he was worried about their spiritual well-being, but not the hogs. So his greatest virtue may have been his consistency, but his worst defect was his rigidity. As one assistant put it, if you put a rose in his hand, it would wilt. Now, there's a professor at Penn, Bruce Kuklick, wrote a book called The Good Ruler. He makes this parallel observation about Hoover. After the crash, Hoover's symbiotic relationship with the public, says Kuklick, changed. In an altered political ecology, he could not viably function. His natural reserve that had signified dignity and restraint came to look like arrogance, indifference, paralysis, and gloom. Nothing more vividly illustrates Kuklick's point than, of course, the parallel policies in Arkansas with the farmers and their hogs. When he was elected, Hoover was idolized as the prototypical engineering statesman and the perfect president for the so-called new era of social scientific rationality. As the Depression wore on, however, people demanded spiritual encouragement. Something more was required, a fighting faith. Hoover, great failure was that he could provide neither. Why? Well, among other things, his voice was harsh, it was monotonous, it was sonorous. His speeches were dull, uninspiring. He delivered speeches the same way he would drill a mine shaft or that he would construct a bridge. You know, his social intransigence, stolid intransigence, and his monotonous speeches call to mind a wonderful story about Winston Churchill. During the 30s, while FDR was president here, there were ministers, Stanley, Baldwin, Ramsay MacDonald, in London, and quite frankly, they were great statesmen, but they often seemed, when they spoke, like a couple of old men droning on. They were dull and uninspiring. Someone suggested to Churchill, well, maybe they ought to take a look at and try to replicate FDR's fireside chats. Those were inspirational. Those were wonderful. Said Churchill, if they did, the fire would undoubtedly go out. Could have well said the same thing about Hoover. So a lot of humor circulated about Herbert Hoover. When Babe Ruth in 1930 made $80,000, a friend said to him, "Hey, Babe, do you realize you made more money than the President of the United States?" He said, "So what? I had a better year than he did." Another that circulated was this. The Secretary of the Treasury was with Hoover one day, and Hoover said, "Listen, can you lend me a nickel? I want to call a friend." Secretary of the Treasury said, "Here's two. Call them both." Hoover had been dubbed the great engineer. Regrettably, the country now required something far more than engineering. Hoover could not provide that something. He became increasingly withdrawn, sullen, self-pitying. Well, if this was the atmosphere in the rarefied and removed climate of Washington, remember we're looking at the Depression both from the top and the bottom, what then was happening on the ground, on the highways and byways of our land? On the ground, we began to see things our society had never seen before. Things that no one imagined could happen were happening. The suicide rate between 1929 and 1932 went up from 14 per 100,000 to 17.5 per 100,000. T.H. Watkins gives us a glimpse why. Quote, "The survivors," said Watkins, "could be seen everywhere, resolutely dressing for business each morning, reading the classified ads, penciling circles around items, leaving their homes and apartments with the marked up newspapers folded under their arms, mimicking the attitudes of success as they purposely marched off to stand in line in employment agencies and business firms, waiting for hours for interviews during which both parties understood the emptiness of the ritual but dared not let truth steal in for fear that it might have endured. Each day their suits grew a little more worn, a little less clean, their shoes a little less bright, their strides a little less brisk," end quote. Pretty soon, Watkins goes on, these tattered remnants of our once proud middle class no longer bothered to congregate in the overheated rooms of the employment agencies, thick as they were with cigarette smoke, frayed tempers, frantic clerks and anxious applicants. More often than not, they just walked the streets and sat unmoving on a park bench, staring hungrily at the begging pigeons, wondering what they could tell the family when they returned. Stress on family life was incalculable. Fear led to marital incompatibility, alcoholism, loss of self-esteem, impotence among men, and suicide. Noted sociologists for the time observed that even at the end of the decade of the 30s, when things were beginning to get a little bit better, the feeling of disturbance and humiliation apparently exists, and irrespective of the intellectual convictions of the man, in his own estimation, he fails to fulfill the very touchstone of his manhood, the role of family provider. Well, if Hoover wouldn't help, who would? Well, the International Apple Shippers Association, for one. They had an idea, but it was not exactly a Hoover idea, not a selfless one. In October 1930, there was a surfeit of apples out on the West Coast, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest. Now, at that time, a box contained 72 apples, and people didn't have the money to buy apples. I mean, you know, apples were cheap, but no one had the money to buy them. So they would extend credit in the morning to an apple seller who would come, $1.75 for the box. They would extend them the credit, give them the box. They would sell the apples at a nickel apiece or whatever. They'd come back at the end of the day, and they could usually pay back the $1.75, and they could usually turn a profit of $1.85. Well, thousands of people began to sell apples. thousands throughout the United States. There were 6,000 alone apple sellers in New York City. They even coined a term, did the Apple Shippers Association, buy an apple a day and eat the depression away. Well, based on this, they were lined up in the streets of New York, Milwaukee, Boston, throughout the country. Cleveland, we had many. I remember seeing them. Some of you may remember seeing them. Suppliers' greed set in eventually. The apple shippers raised the price of the box from $1.75 to $2.35, which reduced the profit to $1.35 a box. Well, take out 2, 3, 4 rotten apples, pay the subway or bus fare to wherever you had to go to get the apples and return and so forth. There wasn't much left. So eventually that died out. But Hoover's Labor Department never kept them on the ranks of the unemployed. He took them and removed them from the statistics of the employed. And actually his rationale was, well, many people left their jobs for more profitable ones. It was, of course, a Hoover illusion. The apple sellers soon disappeared, but not before thousands of American apple sellers had become part of a legend and a lasting mark of the Great Depression. You see an apple seller, the first thing you think of is the Great Depression. Increasingly, living conditions for many became intolerable, and homes became non-existent. As a result, many of the homeless in the city of New York simply walked the streets, but a number of them would sleep in men's and women's rooms of train stations, flop houses, and finally in what came to be called, euphemistically, Hoovervilles. These were shanty towns, mostly constructed of wood packing crates, corrugated metal, tin cans, and whatever was discarded. And they would pop up all over. There was one called Hoover Valley in the middle of Central Park, and it was so significant that eventually it was recognized by the Parks Department with a post office address. There were dozens of shanty towns along Riverside Drive, dozens along the two rivers in the empty lots of the Bronx and on the flats in Brooklyn, but I never saw them. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. I know about those Hoovervilles only from books. However, I remember very, very vividly that we lived on Linfield Road in the suburb of Cleveland. And perpendicular to our road, at the end of Linfield Road, perpendicular was a road called Scottsdale. And behind Scottsdale was a thick wooded area. It went on forever, as far as I was concerned, as a little kid. We called it the Scottsdale Woods. Our parents said, never go there. Never go there because there are dangerous people in those woods and they'll hurt you. They'll get you. They got guns. So what did you do when you were a kid? When your parents told you not to go, you went, of course. Like Red Skelton's Mean Widow Kid. I don't know if you remember listening to Red Skelton at any time, but he used to say, if I doed it, I get a whipping. I doed it. That was Red Skelton. That was us. So Dickie Davis, Bobby Powers, and I decided we would go down there because in numbers, there's strength. Well, we were about 7 or 8 years old. We ventured down the Linfield Road. We entered the Scottsdale Woods. Well, we tentatively went in about 100 yards or so, hid behind a clump of trees, and looked. And there we saw exactly that. Campfires, people cooking, squirrels and rabbits, and corrugated metal containers. Shanties made of boxes, wooden crates, whatever they could find. And then suddenly we spotted the guns. There were guns. And then there were 2 rather lanky guys coming toward us. Bobby yelled, "Hey, let's get out of here, fast, run!" So we turned, we panicked, we ran through the woods about as fast as I've ever run in my life. I'm sure we set an Olympic record. We never looked back. We got out onto Linfield Road. Thank goodness we're out on Linfield Road. We didn't stop. We ran down Linfield Road, all the way to our house, went in, slammed the door. Never went back, never looked back, never went near the Scottsdale Woods after that. Well, time went by. I'd only been about 7 at the time. And we moved away. 2-3 years later, we moved to another neighborhood. Over the years, I began to think, I was a kid. It was really a figment of my imagination. I was reading too much Huckleberry Finn, or maybe I was reading too much Dickens' Great Expectations. Time went by, 1948 came, and I graduated mid-year in high school. Well, I had to wait from January through to September before I go to college, so I got a job. Got a job as a surveyor's assistant. And I would hold the rod and the tape when the surveyor would focus his transit. And we went around to a lot of places in suburban Cleveland, and one of them we went was to Scottsdale Woods. Why? Well, the veterans were coming back from the Second World War. They needed housing. And the Scottsdale Woods was going to be the center and focal point of some of that housing. I went into the Scottsdale Woods, and I got in about 100 yards, and I stopped short. I looked, and there were the shanties. There were the corrugated metal boxes, cardboard boxes, and there were the remnants of what had been the campfire. It wasn't a dream after all. I now realize in retrospect who these folks were. These were folks that had come up, they were hill people, come up from West Virginia, from Kentucky, from Tennessee, to work in the steel mills and other foundries down on the flats of Cleveland along the Cuyahoga River. Of course, they were stuck in Cleveland when the Depression hit, and they could no longer afford the rent of their meager rental housing in downtown Cleveland, so they'd found what they could. These were folks who were desperate. They were desperate people, forlorn, out of work, driven, dispossessed, probably more afraid of us than we were of them. Typical situation in the times. Many Americans similarly evicted and otherwise unsatisfied with their lot took to the road. They traveled by thumb. Highways and streets were filled with hitchhikers. Thumbing a ride became part of our vernacular. But a great number of Americans took to the rails. And so it was that there developed along the rail lines of our country a unique subculture. Now, people had been seeking to escape for a long time before the Depression. We had a hobo culture in this country. And there were migrant farm workers. It was moving around, was in our blood. The migrant farm workers would get on the roads and railroads, and they would simply go from one place to another. They would follow the potato harvest in Maine, the cranberry bogs in Massachusetts, the beet harvests in Michigan. They would go down to Florida for the tomato harvests, the wheat harvests in Kansas. There was a whole culture of that. There was a hobo culture in this country. They had a convention in 1933 out in Britt, Iowa. Some worked, some didn't. Basically, that's what they were. But during the Depression, the ranks of these migrant workers and hobos were swollen by the flow of the desperate. The desperate would climb onto boxcars, destination anywhere, and just go. At one point in the Depression, officials of the Santa Fe Railroad and other railroads, like the Great Northern, Union Pacific, estimated that there were 683,000 of them riding the boxcars at any one time. Enormous. Far more than there were passengers riding the 20th Century Limited or the California Zephyr. Watkins, T.H. Watkins, the author, quotes one of them, a fellow by the name of Maury Steam Train Graham, who had gone on the bum in 1931, and observed the following, ironically. It was not at all unusual, said the steam train, to see a train headed in one direction, loaded with transients traveling in search of work, pass another train with just as many job seekers aboard going in the opposite direction, and neither group knowing that there was no work in either direction. For a short while, the famous broadcast journalist Eric Severide, you may recall him, age 20, unemployed, rode the rails. And he wrote a book about it, even though he was 20 at the time. He wrote a book called The Not So Wild a Dream. Severide gives this vivid description of life on the road, quote, A new social dimension, the great underground world, peopled by tens of thousands of American men, women, and children, white, black, brown, and yellow, who inhabited the jungle, eat from blackened tin cans, find warmth at night in boxcars, take the sun by day on flat cars, steal one day, beg with cap in hand the next, fight with fists and often razors, hold sexual intercourse under a blanket in a dark corner of a railroad car, wander from town to town, anxious for the next place, tired of it in the day, happy only when the wheels are clicking under them, the telephone poles slipping by, end quote. The rails were full of American children. They were refugees from families torn apart by despair, angry, violent, often brutal family life. Hard times had driven them away. Families couldn't afford them. They went out onto the road. And they flocked together. For in numbers there was greater safety. For the boys and girls both. See, there were boy tramps and there were girl tramps. And the girl tramps had learned quickly that safety in numbers could be found only in boxcars. Girls in the boxcars were not at the mercy of any man on the road, whatever their relations might be with the boys in the boxcars. In case of illness, the boys and the girls would have friends to comfort and care for them and to mitigate the fear of being alone and being spied on. Such was the subculture that we had spawned in this country. But we were self-reliant people. And this is a very interesting thing about our culture and about our people at that time. Gives great hope. In January 1930, an editorial appeared in the local Muncie, Indiana newspaper, very significant to me. It went like this. It lamented the suffering caused by the crash, but implored people to help others to help themselves by make-work projects. If you can afford it, the article implored, create odd jobs for the unemployed, not charity. Following the lead, the country's most popular home improvement magazine, one called The American Home, published a list of 100 home improvement projects that everything from building a breakfast nook to covering heating pipes that you could give these people to do. The editors asked, find a few items that you can carry out not only for your own sake, but for the benefit of those to whom charity is an unwelcome but last resort, end quote. Marvelous thing. To my way of thinking, this was American self-reliance at its very best. What was happening here? Basically, we were reaching out to the less fortunate in the face of the greatest economic challenge in our history. Some people were. And unknowingly, that little paper in Muncie, Indiana, had reached the apogee of the 10 degrees of charity formulated by that great medieval sage, Maimonides, who said basically the highest degree of charity is to enable someone to provide for themselves. American Home and Muncie were shining American examples of this superlative value. And that value, incidentally, fit the Hoover construct like a glove. Our self-reliant values found outlets for hope in other ways, some in endurance contests. There were six-day roller derbies. There were talking and walking marathons, dance marathons. You may recall the graphic description of the dancers who dropped from exhaustion in a pitiable depiction of the dancers there in a marathon in a movie called They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, with Jane Fonda not too long ago. One form of self-reliance at work was the Fuller Brush Company. During the Depression, the number of door-to-door Fuller Brush salesmen mushroomed, and no home was immune. And the Fuller Brush Company sales climbed by $1 million a year during the very depths of the Depression. Fuller Brush salesmen were constant butt of jokes. In particular, I remember one that used to visit Fibber, McGee, and Molly. And he always used to arrive just as Fibber opened that closet. He would go toward that closet. You may remember, if you ever listened to Fibber, McGee, and Molly, Molly would say, no, don't. She wouldn't be in time. He'd get it, and the whole contents of the closet would come pouring out onto poor Fibber McGee. While he was under that closet, all that stuff, the doorbell would ring, and it was the Fuller Brush salesman. Well, they were pushy. They were tough. this Fuller brush salesman used to always say, a hope, and Molly would always buy a brush from him. They were hard sell, often unwelcome. In some communities, they had to be licensed. In others, they had to be fingerprinted. Nonetheless, they sold everything from soap to Bibles. And few homes were without an excess brush or two. I know that ours, we had a bunch of them, just like Molly McGee. There were many generous people during the Depression. My grandmother was one of them. She didn't live in the suburbs. She lived in a less than affluent neighborhood in Cleveland proper. But I often stayed with her, and I remember people used to come by with little signs that said, "We'll work for food." She would bring them in. She would find something for to do. Never turned them away. Never turned them away empty. Always found something for them to do for their self-esteem, and she fed them. There was never a threat of violence. She had no fear of it. I didn't realize it then. I was a child, but I do now. This was America at its finest. But not all of our hungry were supine, which brings me to the story of the River Rouge riots. In August 1931, Henry Ford shut down the River Rouge plant in Dearborn to retool. He was going from the Model A now to the Model Ford V8. Eventually became a very successful model. The laying off of tens of thousands of people proved to be a catastrophe. When he did resume, pay had now dropped from $7 a day to $4 a day, and the working day had increased from 8 hours to 10 hours. Oh yeah, and the Ford speed-up was now already a Ford tradition. People could perhaps eke out now just $1,000 a year. It was hardly subsistence pay. Probably not enough. But people work now on a speed-up basis, and if you couldn't keep up, you were dropped. Men worked, they shook with exhaustion, endured, they hung on, but they had to. It was a stress test of the highest magnitude and a matter of life and death. This was no dance marathon. This was for real. Well, Henry Ford, that great Horatio Alger, that great scion of industry, a model for American youth, he was now reviled by his employees and feared for his life. He now absented himself from the plant and hired a garden variety street thug by the name of Harry Bennett, a strong-armed goon, to run his factories. Bennett eventually overran Edsel Ford and was very, very obviously responsible for Edsel Ford fortunes falling within the company, believe it or not. Bennett instituted an elaborate spy system. Now this garden variety street thug also drank a lot, and he would often be found passed out on the bathroom floor in the plant. He wasn't passed out at all. He was listening. He was spying. And it was this big brother atmosphere carried to the extreme by Bennett and his goons in the Ford plant that caused some major problems now. Putative union organizers were summarily fired as troublemakers, purportedly hired by Jewish financiers. Oh yes, of course, Ford was a notorious anti-Semite. Now, of course, a hunger strike was begun against Ford on March 7, 1932. The strikers demanded abolition of Bennett's spy system, reduction of the speed-up of production, and a 7-hour day and a right to organize. Unfortunately, a small but highly vocal organized cadre of communists now made their presence known. A group calling themselves the Detroit Unemployed Council sponsored a protest march on March 7, 1932. Formed in Detroit, but its destination was that infamous Gate 3 of the River Rouge plant in Dearborn, which we encountered last week on January 2, 1929. This was just beyond the Detroit city line. Now they had a very friendly mayor of Detroit. His name was Frank Murphy, and he gave him a permit to march. They did not have a friendly mayor of Dearborn, and unfortunately, the plant was just over the Dearborn line. In fact, the mayor of Dearborn was a man by the name of Clyde Ford. Ford was not only a distant relative of Henry Ford, but he was a Ford dealer to boot. The diabolical Harry Bennett took no chances. When the marchers crossed the Detroit line and reached Dearborn, the acting chief of police demanded to see their permit. They shouted back, "We don't need a permit, we got one," meaning they had one from Murphy. They moved across the Dearborn line down Miller Road toward the gate a few hundred yards away, that notorious Gate 3. Police then fired tear gas into the crowd. The wind swirled around, the tear gas hit the police themselves, felled policemen and marchers indiscriminately. The marchers answered with a volley of tear gas by picking up pieces of slag. That's all they had. They were unarmed. They were throwing it at the police. From an overpass, firefighters now began to spray the crowd with the fire hoses, shades of the brutal shape-up in January 2, 1929. It was freezing cold. The temperature stood at 0. Harry Bennett himself now decided to intervene. He jumped out of his car, accosted the first marcher he saw, who turned out to be a young man by the name of Joseph York, one of the Young Communist League leaders. Bennett was then struck by a large piece of slag, fell to the ground bleeding profusely, but dragged York with him. Well, the machine guns at this on the overpass opened up, killing York, spraying bullets indiscriminately into the crowd. York and 4 other marchers were killed, including a 16-year-old boy. Over 60 people were wounded. The wounded were rounded up by the Dearborn police and jailed. Some of them were luckless prisoners, were chained to their cots and were refused medical treatment. National sentiment tended to side with the marchers. 5 days later, there was another march. This time it was a funeral march through the streets of Detroit for Joseph York and the other dead, slain workers. Some estimated the crowd as high as 30,000, others as high as 40,000. But the leadership of this march was clear. The coffins were draped in red. Many of the marchers wore red armbands, carried communist banners, and the band played the Internationale. T.H. Watkins noted that the Communist Party in the United States would never again march in such numbers or be given quite so large a measure of public sympathy. But it happened. Now, only 2 years after Ford had been voted the most admired man in the country since Jesus Christ and Napoleon Bonaparte, the strong-arm lieutenant Harry Bennett had now set up machine gun nests at Ford's estate, and not without good reason. The River Rouge riot in the freezing cold of Dearborn, that March of 1932, was one of the first major violent incidents following the market crash of October 29th, but it pales in comparison to another incident which happened in the hot, sweltering sun less than 3 months later in Washington, D.C. The participants in this drama, however, would have been absolutely appalled to hear themselves characterized as radicals or communists or anything of the sort. They were the most patriotic Americans of the time. They were men that were veterans of the American Expeditionary Force that had gone over to fight in World War I. Wilson, of course, had dubbed them by the euphemism AEF, American Expeditionary Force. Now they were seeking to accelerate payment of a $4 billion bonus that had voted them back in 1924. The only hitch in the bonus was that it was not to be paid to them until 1945. It was a $4 billion amount which was to be placed in an endowment fund and pay them $1 a day in 1945, but not until 1945, $1 a day for every day they had spent in the Army and $1.25 a day for every day they'd spent in Europe. It was estimated that with the endowment interest that would accrete on this fund, by 1945, most of them would get at least $1,000, perhaps more or less, depending on their time of service. Well, this state of affairs wasn't disturbed until 1929, where a young congressman by the name of Wright Patman from Texas introduced legislation to accelerate the date of payment. The Depression hadn't yet hit, the market hadn't yet crashed, but Wright Patman, this young Texan congressman, was trying to curry favor with veterans organizations. Believe it or not, at that point, the veterans organizations sort of ignored it, nobody got behind it, nothing came of it. But following the market crash, Patman's cause was suddenly embraced by the likes of the Hearst newspapers and, of course, the likes of radio priest Father Charles Coughlin, whose star was then in the ascendancy. So Patman reintroduced the bill. And in January 1931, with great fanfare, people began to get on the bandwagon. A great number of congressmen among them jumped on the bandwagon and wanted to put this thing through. Despite the fact that he sympathized with the veterans, and he did, Hoover was convinced that the country just couldn't afford the $4 billion at this time without going into further debt or raising taxes. This he didn't want to do. Both houses passed a compromise bill in February 1931 calling for partial immediate payment. Hoover vetoed it and successfully defeated a congressional attempt to override his veto. He was now beginning to be vilified by many as a tool of the bankers and a man against the common people. The rigidity was now coming out into play. Hoover, the great engineer, the great humanitarian, only 2 years before, was now becoming the butt of anger and frustration born out of desperation. The veterans were bitter. Now is when they needed this money, not in 1945. They were destitute. The $400 to $500 that was given them now would feed their families for 6 months, give them a home. That was the difference between starving to death and being able to eat. They weren't asking for a dole, they shouted. They only wanted what was theirs. They'd earned it, and they were entitled to it for having served their country well and put their lives on the line, many of them in the trenches of France and Belgium. Veterans in Portland, Oregon, led by a veteran by the name of Walter Waters, decided to go to Washington to present their grievances. Well, they couldn't go because they couldn't buy transportation. So they simply blockaded the tracks of the Union Pacific Railroad in Portland and commandeered several boxcars to begin their trek to the east. Well, by the time they'd reached Pocatello, Idaho, they'd elected Waters as their commander-in-chief, and they'd dubbed themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF. 18 days later, a greatly expanded BEF landed in Washington. There was a groundswell of support as these folks came across the United States. In Washington, they caught a break. The police chief was a man by the name of Pelham G. Glassford, chief of the Metropolitan Police. He was himself a veteran. He welcomed them, believe it or not, and actually found a commissary to feed them and gave them an old abandoned government building to live in. It was expected they would be in and out very quickly. They would hold a demonstration and then leave. Didn't happen that way. The commissary was financed by some private donations. Glassford himself even contributed to it. Well, more donations came in, and more thousands of veterans began to pour into Washington from all over the nation. There was a serene and uneventful atmosphere surrounding this whole affair that lasted for weeks, as thousands more veterans now began to find their way to the Capitol. By mid-June, estimates of their numbers ranged from 15 to 20,000. By this time, however, they were forbidden by the Metropolitan Police from living in these abandoned government buildings. And what began to happen was the Metropolitan Police now spread them among a number of camps. There were at one time 27 camps around Washington. Eventually, most of them were herded into a camp called Anacostia across the bridge. On June 15th, the House passed a bill accelerating the bonus. They passed it by 209 to 176. 12,000 veterans now massed outside the Senate building as victory seemed within their grasp. But the Senate now, at Hoover's urging again, turned down the bill by a vote of 62 to 18. You think they rioted? They didn't at this point. The men outside, thousands of them, simply began to sing America and then dispersed to their various encampments in and around the Capital District. Problem was, they didn't go home. It was all orderly, quite moving actually. There was no violence, but the administration was fearful. Traditionally, the president would attend the last session of Congress. This time, he didn't. Congressmen were advised to leave through underground tunnels. They did. Many of the veterans did not leave Washington. They stuck around. They were now homeless. They had no place to go. Most of them were now in Anacostia, there with their families as well. This was located across a bridge from D.C. It's estimated it now housed as many as 15,000 of them. 1,100 of them were women and children. The government had herded as many people into this area as they possibly could, and across the bridge so as to empty the government buildings, which were unsafe, but also for control purposes. They figured strategically they could block the bridge if need be and deny the veterans access to the city. It's exactly what happened. Many of the veterans were reluctant to stay in the Anacostia encampment. Why? Well, because it was massive, it was unsightly, sanitation facilities were poor, medical facilities were woefully inadequate, drinking water was becoming unsafe, disease was inevitable. They wanted to get out. So finally a number of them crossed over the bridge, defying Glassford's orders, and occupied several abandoned government buildings in the area of 13th and B Streets in D.C. Although Hoover had been sympathetic to the plight of the veterans and even quietly arranged a transportation allowance of $100,000 to help them get back, close to 10,000 still remained in the district at this time. On July 28th, the Metropolitan Police wanted to clear the government buildings, and Waters, however, at this point, this is the first violence, led a movement of veterans to seize the Anacostia Bridge. Scuffle broke out with the police, the first violence of the entire episode. At this point, several policemen were injured, 2 veterans were shot, both veterans died. Now at this point, Hoover made a fatal blunder. He authorized the Secretary of War, Patrick Hurley at that time, to call in the Army. The Chief of Staff was none other than Douglas MacArthur. The written orders issued to MacArthur were strictly limited. Surround the affected men and clear, but use all humanity consistent with the due execution of the order, end quote. What happened next has become the subject of myth and much controversy since. Many of the facts have no doubt been blown all out of proportion of what actually happened. One thing, however, is crystal clear. MacArthur repeatedly disobeyed these orders. He told his second-in-command, who was Dwight Eisenhower at the time, that his true mandate was to rescue the nation from incipient revolution in the air. MacArthur massed troops and cavalry as well as tanks. Had 8 tanks. These people were unarmed. The soldiers and the mounted troops pushed into the crowd of bystanders with bayonets thrusting and sabers slashing. In the considerable mayhem and confusion, there were a number of people cut, severed ears, and at least 1 bayonet wound. Tear gas was used on the veterans still remaining in the government buildings who had been pelting the army with bricks. That's all they had. They were unarmed. The unarmed veterans, of course, were soon routed. Newsman Thomas Stokes of the time remembered 8 years later, quote, General MacArthur, his chest glittering with medals, strode up and down the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, flipping a riding crop against his neatly pressed breeches. Hoover was crestfallen when he heard the news. His orders had been defiantly disobeyed. Now he sent direct orders that MacArthur was not to cross the bridge into Anacostia. MacArthur, in a foreshadowing events in North Korea 2 decades later, blatantly disregarded these orders as well and ordered his men to charge into the Anacostia encampment. They went over the bridge and they went into Anacostia. Once there, they indiscriminately fired tear gas. Now their targets were feckless veteran families that were living there in shanties and tents. Those by now included 600 men, women, and children. Fires broke out. It was not entirely clear how they were started, but what is clear is that the troops did nothing to put the fires out. The conflagration consumed the entire encampment and reduced it to a smelling, smoldering heap of slag and ashes. The pathetic remnants of these folks slowly wandered out away from the capital, eventually wound up tattered and torn in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, where a mayor by the name of Eddie McCloskey, in a humanitarian gesture, took them in. MacArthur later insisted that the burning was necessary so that the marchers would not return and force his men, his soldiers, to bivouac under the guns of traitors. He is also reported to have said that the marchers had intended to take over the country. The remnants of the marches related nightmare stories of their ordeal, some perhaps more apocryphal than others. We'll never know. But together with the earlier myths spread by the Hearst Press and others, they were now becoming part of a legend and a mystique surrounding the event. And as the word spread, Hoover's image was buried even deeper. Well, Hoover made another major error at this point, which was certainly damaging to his presidency and probably was the final nail in the coffin of his campaign for re-election. Mind you, at this time, the summer of 1932, he was campaigning for re-election against FDR. After the event, despite MacArthur's crass insubordination, Hoover took full responsibility for the events. Major mistake. He did not even reprimand MacArthur, thereby establishing a regrettable precedent. Although Hoover was initially tolerant of the veterans' demands and restrained in his approach to them, his thinking changed after the rout. Eventually, long after his presidency had ended, Hoover came to believe that there had indeed been a communist conspiracy to overthrow the government. Ironically, major Democratic leaders and even FDR himself were opposed to this bonus, even when for a variety of reasons. Although, as we'll see next week, a similar march took place during FDR's presidency, was handled in a totally different way. Nonetheless, Roosevelt himself twice vetoed a bonus, although a modified form of it finally did pass in 1936. The mythology, however, surrounding this event would change as time went on. History rewrote it many different ways, paralleling the political climate of the various times. During the 30s, the left liberal interpretation of this was, of course, after FDR was elected, Hoover, they put the blame squarely on the shoulders of Hoover and the Army. During the late 40s, and particularly during the paranoia of the early 50s and McCarthy era, as anti-communist paranoia swept the country witnessed another revisionist form of bonus march history. Now, the conservative right was extolling the virtues of both Hoover and McCarthy, and his hands trembled. By the end of his term, he was a pathetic figure, almost a recluse in the White House. FDR now knew that victory in November was a virtual certainty. 3 months later, as the election returns came in over the radio, confirming his prediction, FDR, listening in his home in Hyde Park, confided to his son James, "You know, James, all of my life, I've only been afraid of one thing, fire. Now I'm afraid I can't do the job. Pray for me." A desperate nation now prayed with him. Thank you. Next week, of course, we're going to get into FDR. The next two sessions will involve two particular questions about FDR. The first, of course, will be, what did he really cure? Did he cure anything? The second will deal with the issue of why he did not cross the line to despotism. He easily could have. Given this situation in the country in 1933, when he took office in March of 33, he could very well have crossed the line to despotism. Many people, in fact, were calling for him to become a dictator. Things were so desperate at the end of the Hoover term and during the interregnum period between Hoover and FDR. So we'll get into those two aspects of FDR over the next two talks. This colossus that basically dominated our political scene for the next 12 years. Any of you have experiences during this period of time? I know one of you outside was talking to me about some wonderful experiences during this time. Any thoughts about the Hoover administration, about what went on here? Please feel free to raise your hand and talk anytime you'd like. Anybody have anything? Yes, yes, sir. Man.
My father was a pharmacist in New York, and we were living in an apartment at that time. The rent was $25 a month. We couldn't get gasoline during the Second World War during that time. I was born in 1937.
Right.
I had an experience, but as a child, you really didn't feel that you were being deprived of anything. I was in a carriage and you were fed, and that was it. Mm-hmm. We had a Model T4 during those days, because during the desperate times you couldn't buy a car.
Right.
We didn't have it. But he mentioned one thing from time to time. We all worked in the store, because it was my father opened up the cash register and said, "This is our income that we have here."
Wow.
So honor it, he said, because if there's no money in here, we don't eat.
Yeah.
That was our only source of
Great story. That's yeah.
16 hours a day.
Wow.
7 days a week, and that was it. It was amazing. He bought Tomacan shoes in those days, and he could stand for 16 hours on his feet, which was
remarkable
to me as a child.
I have trouble standing on my feet here for an hour and a half. That's marvelous.
I still have flat feet today. When I got out of the bathtub for the first time after I was married, my wife said, look at the outline of your foot. It's you don't have any arches. Well, I guess I must have at one time. He said that Macy, he would sell toothpaste.
Yeah.
Squib toothpaste.
Right.
And he said, I can't sell. It was a lost product, because Macy's would sell toothpaste for 3/4 of the price that he was selling it for.
Yeah.
Some of the lost leaders were.
Like people today having trouble competing with Walmart and Costco, I suppose. He had the same kind of problem in the Depression. Can you all hear? Do we need a little roving? Do we have a roving mic, Joe, back there at all for people? Can you all hear what people are saying? Okay. Any other thoughts about the great? Yes, ma'am.
I grew up in Washington, D.C., born in 1922.
Wow.
My father took us to see the shanty towns before these riots.
The Hoovervilles.
Hoovervilles.
Yeah.
And what the result of that was, both of my parents, who were Rockford Republicans, changed parties. They became Democrats.
That's a great story. Anybody else? Yes.
Not everybody suffered during the Depression.
Yes, I know.
An awful lot of people did very, very well. And
it's true.
I think that's something very important to remember.
Absolutely.
The way the current situation is.
Yep.
And,
absolutely.
Life went on, jewelry was bought, and dances happened, and theater went on, and literature, and all kinds of things.
All those things.
No regard to what was happening.
Yep, there were a number of people that had that experience, and as a matter of fact, when I taught the course at Williams, I went looking, because what I wanted to do was have the students in the class interview people and take oral histories. And actually, the first two people that I interviewed here, who were patients of doctors that I knew in the community, actually described just what you described. they hadn't really experienced the Depression. They were sort of immune from it or immunized from it by their parents, who were not that badly off. As a matter of fact, here in Williamstown, someone told me when Roosevelt came through campaigning, he was cheered on one street and booed severely on another. And there were people actually booing him, but they were in different spots, okay? What I wound up doing is I found a place called St. Joseph's Court in North Adams, which was a place where folks, adults were living. And they were adults that had lived through the Great Depression. Most of them were sons and daughters of mill workers. And I very tentatively brought the class over there, about 15 kids, and they were sitting around, the folks, having coffee and cake, and immediately the kids gravitated to them immediately. I was afraid I had a list of around 20 questions I wanted to try to jumpstart this experience. I didn't need to at all. By the time I looked around over my shoulder, the kids were at the tables, they were talking to them, and there were wonderful stories given. I remember one particularly of a woman who said she had only one toy. She had a doll. And that doll would disappear about 3 weeks before Christmas every year, and it would reappear under the Christmas tree with a new dress. That was basically what she had. I remember other people that said, well, we had this. We had 10 kids in our family, but when the floods came, and there were floods in North Adams, there were pretty severe ones, we took in another 8. So we had, 18 kids in people sleeping horizontally in the beds. They brought the beds together. They made do. Vendors gave them credit. People worked together. There was a lot of voluntary cooperation, particularly among people that were suffering. Yes, ma'am, back there. Thank you very much for that microphone. Thanks.
One of our family stories was that it got really bad. Sometimes that my grandfather only had a nickel in his pocket, and he didn't want his kids to worry. So we had the nickel changed into 5 pennies, so it would jingle, and he could jingle the money in his pocket so that he thought he had a lot more money than he.
Terrific. Great story. Anybody else have any stories of this time, or any thoughts about the period whatsoever? Were there others? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. You're running a marathon here with that, Mike, but that's great. Thank you. Very much appreciated.
A woman over in Spencertown told me this. I had a personal story, but this will really knock me out. The people in Spencertown at this period were shooting songbirds for food.
My God. Wow.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
About this period.
Sure.
Is this a true thing? I read it somewhere that Mellon, who was the secretary
Yep.
of the Treasury, told Hoover, "Don't worry about it. This is all normal."
Absolutely, it's true.
This is the way it should.
Yeah. Mellon was a total disaster. It was an absolute disaster during this period. Yeah.
And do you know anything about Eisenhower? Eisenhower was in the field. He saw all this happen. Did he ever talk about this?
You know something? Yeah. I read something just the other day. Eisenhower was involved in the situation with MacArthur.
Yeah.
And he was not a great admirer of MacArthur, I must tell you, but he was a subordinate at that time. And basically he had said in the interview that I read that essentially they were following orders. He did not necessarily go along with them. The idea of sabers slashing veterans really bothered him, but it was nonetheless, these were the orders, and he had to follow them. So Eisenhower was a subordinate at that time. He was following orders, but he was not happy about it. Yeah, that's exactly what happened there. Any other hands up at this time? Any ideas, any thoughts? Feel free to express yourself at any time and ask me any questions you'd like at any time. Next week we're going to get into a totally different atmosphere. The cavalry arrives, FDR. Was there somebody up there that wanted? Yes, Susan, there's another question.
I just remember my father saying, the good old days, they were terrible.
Yeah, they were. They were in many ways, but in many ways they were very elevating. And we'll get into some of that next week. Totally different atmosphere. Thank you. You've been great, and see you all next week.